Etrian Odyssey is the ultimate RPG series for people that love pushing games to their limits. These games will give you a massive number of options to use as you conquer all the massive threats the game will throw at you, whether it's through setting up massive elemental chain reactions made up of dozens of hits per turn, doing an elaborate multi-turn setup in preparation for your one big battle-winning hit, or just by making sure that you never get hit by an enemy in the first place. And that's only scratching the surface. Once you finish one of these games, you'll immediately start formulating an entirely new strategy for the next time you wander into the Labyrinth. You are in complete control of how you want to get their damage output to ridiculous levels. Look at a skill like Sacrifice, which kills a party member in exchange for an incredibly strong attack that scales in damage based off the HP your victim had. That would probably go really well with the Medic's Overheal skill to get crazy damage numbers. And you probably also want to use the War Magus' War Revive, which will let you keep your victim alive for another sacrifice later on. Ecstasy is one of the most powerful attacks you can use, but only if your target is inflicted with binds. So if you want to take full advantage of it, you probably want to include something like a Hexer to keep all your targets bound. The Vampire skill, which heals your row for a portion of the damage you deal, would be really useful in offsetting the party HP drain effect of the Highlander's Legion thrust. Once you start reading these skill trees, it won't be long until you find a set of pieces that fit so well together that you need to build a team around them. These are games where you can make your medics your biggest damage dealers if you build your team right, and their numbers will not disappoint. If all this sounds interesting to you and you want to give the series a shot, play Etrian Odyssey II Untold. And if you can't play that, then go with Etrian Odyssey III HD. But if you want to hear more about what the series has to offer before buying one of these games, or you just want to know why I recommend these two games in particular, that's what this video is for. So let's get into it. The first big question that usually gets asked is, do you need to play the games in order? The answer is no, and you probably shouldn't. The first game in the series has some really divisive design and balancing decisions. I do not recommend starting with that one. It has by far the highest chance of either making you frustrated to the point of quitting, or making you bored enough that you put the game down and never pick it back up, especially if you play the original DS version. If this describes your experience with the series, don't worry. The games get a lot smoother, and you'll probably have a way better chance of enjoying the two that I recommended. All the games are self-contained. You create a completely fresh set of adventurers and start exploring a brand new labyrinth in each game. The game's stories aren't what draws most players to Etrian Odyssey. The real focus of these games is the team building and battle mechanics. It's up to you to figure out what you want to do and start building towards it. The team you choose to bring into the Labyrinth is completely up to you. You're free to bring a team of edgy warriors who share a common goal of killing a god, or a charismatic bard looking for inspiration with the 4 members of his fan club he thinks are the cutest, or even an army of animals equipped with bikini armor because they hear it will give them the endurance they need to protect their homeland. Or if you're a cruel monster, you could also spend extra money on 2 PNGs and run this poor medic out of a job. Of course, you would never crush your dreams by throwing your money away like that, right? Your party can't have more than 5 members, and there's usually at least 10 classes in each of these games. Your team won't be able to do everything, but it really doesn't need to. There's always an extremely wide variety of teams that can beat these games on the hardest difficulty without grinding, at least if you know what you're doing. The problem that most players have with these games is that they don't know what they're doing, and it's really not their fault. The game just doesn't give players enough information to make informed decisions. Let's take the skill Hazy Arrow as an example. It's a skill from Untold 2's Survivalist class, and its in-game description reads, range stab attack with 100% hit rate. Usable only if user has dodged an attack last turn. Okay, so if I get this character to dodge, I can use a skill to guarantee that their next attack hits. It's nice, but it doesn't seem to be anything to write home about. Am I really going to spend one of my limited skill points on this? But for each of these games, there are online resources that will tell you the exact stats of each of these skills, complete with things like damage numbers and speed modifiers. If you want to get into the series, I highly recommend using these. Looking at Hazy Arrow, we see that the attack deals over 4 times your usual damage at level 1, and over 8 times the damage when it's fully maxed out. That's when you'll finally understand what the Survivalist class is really about. They've got an entire skill tree based around damage redirection and maximizing evasion, and this is what it's supposed to feed into. If this is something you want to adopt as your playstyle, great. So now you can start thinking about what your plan will be in the first turns of battle. How are you going to set this up? What other party members would benefit from not being targeted by enemy attacks? And what's your backup plan going to be when your Survivalist eventually gets hit and dies? But if this isn't the route you want to go down, there are still plenty of ways to use your Survivalist. From inflicting status ailments, manipulating your party's action order, killing big threats in the enemy's back row, or providing support to your party in the field. Because yeah, the battle system is still only half the game. There's an entire labyrinth for you to map on your touchscreen. When you're playing these games, it's up to you to observe your surroundings and create a map of the labyrinth. Because if you get careless, you're going to get caught off guard by one of the game's many wandering mini-bosses. And those guys have a good chance of causing a game over. There's just something so satisfying about starting with what's effectively a blank sheet of graph paper and turning it into a map where not a single tile has gone to waste. Playing on the 3DS is probably the best way to experience this, since moving from the buttons to the touchscreen is really seamless. Though playing the games on emulator with a controller and mouse, or with a touchscreen on a tablet, can also be a pretty good experience, especially if you have a vertical monitor. Playing on Switch or Steam Deck is harder for me to recommend though. You'll be putting a lot of strain on your left hand when you're changing grips, especially in extended play sessions, but it might work better for you. As long as you're not planning on just using buttons for mapping, you're probably good. So now that we've got that introduction out of the way, let's go over which games you should play. As I mentioned earlier, my top choice is Etrian Odyssey II Untold for the 3DS. It's my favorite game in the series, and the first one I played to completion. If you're getting into the series through my channel and love the theory crafting and build tuning of these games, this is probably the game you want to dive into. They really went above and beyond when it came to giving every single class cool and experimental stuff you want to build around. Every single skill that I mentioned at the start of this video comes from this game, but one of the most intimidating parts of these games to new players comes at the very start. When you have all these choices, how can you be sure the choices you make don't screw you over in the long run? Just learning a single basic skill can require burning a lot of skill points on prerequisites, and you only get one each time you level up. This game is particularly nice since it gives you a lot of skills for free once you meet the prerequisites. For instance, by putting a single point in Sword Mastery, your Dark Hunter will get access to 3 attacks that inflict different statuses. You can use most of your toolkit without locking yourself out of other options. This makes choosing what to spend your skill points on go a lot better than doing it based on skill descriptions alone. And that's not all. This game makes it easier than ever to make up for any shortcomings in your party. That's thanks to the skill trading system, Grimoires. As you go through the game, you randomly obtain copies of the skills that your party uses, and the skills that enemies use. You can give these copies to any party member, or even use them for in-game trades. These trades give you access to skills from every other class in the game. So even if your party wouldn't normally have a way to revive dead party members, you can attract one of these game's healers to pay you a visit, and from there, you can trade for one of the game's revival skills. In addition to the standard combat, healing, and buff skills you might expect, you can also get skills that do things like boost your experience gain, or the number of items you can get from combat and gathering, or give you an extremely high chance of escaping from situations that would otherwise be full party wipes. While the skills you get are random, the game gives you so many of them and so many opportunities to make trades that you'll eventually get a bunch of really good ones. And the best part about the system is that you can get all the benefits of these skills without having to commit any skill points. Just equip a different grimoire and start using it. And there's still one more option the game gives you. You can cook meals that will give you buffs that will allow you to really play to your strengths, or even basically ignore some of your biggest weaknesses. These are especially useful for enabling you to build strategies around bosses. The buff you choose can often take care of the aspect of each boss fight that your team matches up the worst against, and these meals will last forever until you decide to change your buff, so keeping their benefits won't even drain your resources. All these things make the game so much more manageable. This game gives you so many more options to prepare against bosses than just your year and level, so the reason you're dying to boss fights is never because you're underleveled. This game in particular is great for new players, because it really gets them to explore options other than having a bigger number. Now, this isn't very likely to happen in this game due to all the things I've mentioned, but if you find that you somehow seriously messed up your skill point allocation and you want to respec, some of the older games made this incredibly punishing. In the original DS release of Etrian Odyssey, you only had one save slot, so you couldn't just roll back to your last save, and the in-game respec function would cost your character 10 levels. With that game's damage formula, there's a good chance they would just start getting one shot if they weren't grinded back up. Fortunately, the 3DS games aren't nearly that mean. Untold 2 was the first game to give you 9 save slots to rotate through, and the punishment for respecing is only 2 levels, which is a pretty minor drop in stats. This really won't affect you that much, especially since you probably won't do this with more than one party member, if you do it at all. And if you're still anxious about having to make team building decisions, even with all these safety nets in place, this game also has a story mode. It gives you named characters to use, and they come in a cool set of preset classes. There's also a lot about this game itself that makes it really easy to recommend to new players, but the big one is that it's less punishing than most of the other games. Random encounters aren't very likely to lead to a full party wipe, though they still present you with interesting combat scenarios to solve. The game tells you when bosses are coming up, and let you go back to town to prepare. It takes less time than any other game in the series to get back where you left off, since the game lets you teleport to the end of any floor that you already mapped. And if you're really stuck, you can always just lower the difficulty, get through that section, and raise it back up. This game really respects your time. You'll be able to make a meaningful amount of progress in the 10 to 20 minutes you have pulling out your 3DS on a bus or train ride. Now, when it comes to recommending this game, I am well aware the 3DS eShop is down, but game preservation efforts in combination with custom firmware makes it very easy to play the game, both on emulator and on original hardware. Just make sure you show your support for the series, and buy the games that are officially available. That way there will be a better chance of more of them getting made. And speaking of buying the official releases, if you don't want to jump through hoops to be able to get started with the series, Etrian Odyssey III III HD is probably the best starting point of the ones you can buy right now. Its class selection allows for some good build diversity. Its difficulty is consistently at a reasonable level, with real variety in encounter design. Your chance to escape from battle is high enough that going into an encounter unprepared isn't an instant party wipe. And shortcuts are both useful and visually indicated, which really helps to cut down on repeated traversal. I personally think its dungeon and skill tree designs are a bit less interesting than the 3DS games, but overall, it's just a solid game. The big thing that makes playing Etrian Odyssey III HD feel a lot better than the first two is that it lets you grow in more viable ways than just killing random encounters. For instance, this game introduced the Farmer, an entire class designed around supporting the team in ways other than dealing damage. The most important thing they'll be doing in most playthroughs is putting their skill points into gathering skills. Every game has resource nodes you can collect stuff from, and farmers are particularly good at using these to fill your inventory. You'll get so many high-value sellable items that any money problems you have will go away. With a farmer on your team, you'll be able to buy higher-tiered weapons and armor a lot more often. You also hopefully remember that the games have roaming mini-bosses that make up most of the game's navigation puzzles. In the first game, there were a few places where it was just easier and more convenient to try to fight the big monster in your way, and completely ignore the navigation challenge once you're strong enough. So in an active reactionary balancing, Etrian Odyssey II had the right idea of entirely removing the experience you gained from them. So if you really just needed that one last skill point to complete your build, I really hope you like fighting random encounters, because those will be your only source of experience. Thankfully, that was the only game in the series this is true for. Experience from these guys is back in Etrian Odyssey III. Like most RPGs, these games also have quests, and in the first two games, the reward for completing these quests was usually an item that's buyable from the store and nothing else. So a lot of players just ignored most of these once they realized the rewards really aren't worth the time. This not only led a lot of players to be underleveled for ignoring significant chunks of what the developers intended for you to do, it also made them see even less of what little story these games have. Etrian Odyssey III fixed this by making all quests give a good chunk of experience, in addition to making a lot of rewards more useful, so the new set of quests you get each time you reach a new floor are something to really look forward to. And if that wasn't enough, the game also has an entirely different gameplay mode, Seafaring, a more focused navigation puzzle that gives you another opportunity to earn gold and acts as a gateway to an extensive set of exclusive enemy and boss encounters. Of course, you don't need to engage with all of these systems to have enough resources. My first playthrough barely touched Seafaring, and I still had a comfortable amount of money experience through the entire game, and I was playing on the hardest difficulty, or as we knew it back in the DS days, the only difficulty. This is really the game that brought the series in line with modern sensibilities. It set the standard that every future game in the series would follow. This makes it by far the easiest of recent ports to recommend. I should note that this game doesn't have all the generous safety nets that Untold 2 has. You won't be getting free skills, there's no skill trading, there's no meal cooking, and respecking still costs 5 levels. But Etrian Odyssey III does have subclassing. Once you reach a certain point in the game, you can give each of your characters access to an entirely new skill tree, letting you learn almost all the skills from another class. This can really help make up for the defensive weaknesses of your team, or let you push your damage numbers to the next level. So your hoplite doesn't need to limit himself to reducing damage to a single row. By taking the Bushin skill from a ninja subclass, he can make a copy of himself and guard both rows at once. The big downside of this is that you need to commit your limited skill points, and you might find yourself spread thin between both skill trees. There are some really powerful class combinations you can use to break the game though, so it can be a lot of fun theory crafting new ways to get your damage numbers over the top. Now, if you look at other places where people recommend a game to start with, there's one more game that always comes up, and that's Etrian Odyssey IV. But before I get into that game, I need to take this opportunity to plug myself. These videos take a lot of time to put together, and I'm really just doing them for the love of the game. But if you want to help me justify continuing to spend way too much of my time on these videos, I'd really appreciate it if you showed your support by becoming a channel member. My very loyal singular channel member is a little lonely, so it would be great if I had more of you guys here. Thanks again, Inside Chaos, for supporting the channel. Anyways, Etrian Odyssey IV does have a lot of things going for it that would make it appealing as a first game. Your choices are a lot more controlled, to the point where it's really hard to have a truly bad team, or even a bad skill point distribution. Dungeons are smaller in scale and split into chunks, so it will never be long before you can make new progress. It has an early version of Untold 2's meal buff system, letting you get prepared for battles in another way. The game even has subclassing, which gives you a lot of flexibility in party composition. And the game even has you a few pre-built characters, letting you try out some of the game's new classes. It's also probably the easiest game in the series, so you probably aren't going to get stuck for very long. There's just one thing that makes it really hard for me to recommend the game. It's an issue I have that's so big that it single-handedly made the game my least favorite of the 3DS games for a long time, to the point where I didn't even finish the first area. This game is slow. Every single game released up to this point has a movement speed and battle speed so much faster that going back to Etrian Odyssey IV makes it feel like the game is trying to waste your time. And believe it or not, there are options to slow down combat animations even further. But please, don't subject yourself to those. The speed issue gets compounded by how a lot of the cooler skills in the game involve landing lots of hits, and waiting through a lot of enemy recoil animations. On your big damage turns, you're just going to be stuck waiting through a nearly minute-long cutscene. It's bad. And all of this is in a game with incredibly high encounter rates, and a difficulty curve that doesn't do a great job ramping up with your power level. So you're stuck doing the same actions and watching the same unskippable cutscene over and over again. It's really not ideal. Now, this might not be a deal breaker for you, but it basically killed any chance there was for me to enjoy the game. I have reached the point where I am comfortable recommending the game, but only under certain conditions. You need to play on emulator. You need to use the walking speed patch made by Valiant in the car, and you need to play with easy access to a hotkey that lets you toggle the game's speed, so you can listen to the music as Yuzo Koshiro intended when you aren't fast forwarding through the battle animations and sky traversal. Check the pinned comment if you want more details. Once I got everything set up, I really came to appreciate all the game's good aspects, because there is a good amount to like. The big appeal of Etrian Odyssey IV is that it lets everyone become wildly overpowered. If you like chasing big numbers and combos that will let you get dozens of hits in a single turn, this is the game that will make getting to that point the easiest. And its low difficulty means that even the craziest team composition you can think of will perform just fine. But I really cannot recommend playing it on console. So to summarize, if you're only going to play one game here for my recommendations, I'd say your best option would be to go through the straightforward process of getting custom firmware on your 3DS, and play Etrian Odyssey II Untold. If you'd rather play on emulator, I'd still recommend Untold 2, but if you want a game that's less overwhelming with options and makes it even harder to seriously mess up, Etrian Odyssey IV might be a safer pick. And if you can't be bothered to do any of that, Etrian Odyssey III HD is the one I'd recommend out of the ones you can buy today. But if you try one of the games and you like it, you really shouldn't limit yourself to just going straight through it. A lot of players prefer to jump between games, finishing one or two areas in one of them before jumping over to another, letting them experience a different team and different playstyle. I've done this myself, and it can really help keep you from burning out on the series. Now, once you get your hands on your game or games of choice, there's one more choice you'll have to make. What difficulty will you play on? Every game in the series is balanced around the hardest difficulty, with the lower difficulties being added on because not everyone likes spending hours looking at skill trees to theorycraft optimized builds. If you're one of the people that watches my channel to look at things like cool builds, the highest difficulty options will usually lead to the most interesting gameplay experiences, really pushing you to make use of all the tools you have at your disposal, while still being tuned to ensure that you can get through them with lots of different team optimizations, even the really weird ones. Don't let its status as the most difficult option scare you away from giving it a shot. But with that said, these games can be frustrating sometimes. Most players don't want to spend hours banging their head against the wall against the same boss over and over again like I have, especially when some of them really are just overtuned. So no one is going to judge you for turning the difficulty down, getting past one of the difficult bits, and moving on with the game. I just recommend the highest difficulty option as the default, because without the extra push from the higher difficulty, a lot of players just won't engage with the game's more interesting systems, because doing the same mindless set of actions every single time will just keep working. Of course, there are way more reasons you might want to lower the difficulty. It definitely makes it easier for less experienced players to use team compositions without things like healers and tanks, giving you an easier time succeeding with team compositions that go all in on offense. Other players just get too stressed out by the prospect of getting a party wipe and losing all the progress they've made. And some players come to these games just to vibe with the characters, environments, and music. Just play the game the way you want to play it. But before you go off and dive into one of these games, there are some really basic things a lot of new players don't do that would really benefit them in all the games. I'll keep this section quick and simple. Number 1. If you want to make use of the cooler strategies that are possible in this game, you should really look at the entire skill trees for any characters you're considering using. You can't build cool teams around skills like Valiant or Hazy Arrow if you don't know they exist. If you want an easy way to look through all the skill trees, there are online skill simulators that will give you real numbers for things like damage, speed, and accuracy. They really help with avoiding decisions you might regret, and turn these games' hardest difficulties from a guessing game of which of these skills that the developers decide to put big numbers on into a more strategic decision-making process. How else are you supposed to know that a skill with the description uses comrades on either side as bait for physical attacks describes a counter skill? Number 2. Basically, all the items will be viable in the shop, so don't be afraid to use them in situations where they make your life easier. The most important item is the Arianda thread, a cheap way to instantly warp back to town, letting you save, heal, and shop. You should always have at least one in your inventory, but the healing, buff, status, and attack items can all be used to great effect, and are often really important for enabling certain party compositions to reach their full potential. The revival nectars in particular are pretty much a requirement for most teams that don't run nomadic, and a lot of encounters go so much easier when you can cripple them with ailment turbines. And the area of effect elemental spell items are the most important part of one of the strongest builds in some of these games. Number 3. There are more ways to improve your survivability than just armor and level grinding. Before you give up up on a boss and decide to start grinding, consider buying things like accessories to give your party resistance to the big elemental attacks or status inflictions. Try to increase the action speed of your medic, letting you get your party healed before they get hit again and die. Take advantage of the innate damage reduction that being in the back row gives you. Remember that the defend option exists. A good strategy will usually make you way more effective at getting through boss fights than wasting several hours of your life grinding random encounters. Bosses are usually going to be the most difficult part of the game, so it's usually a good idea to save some skill points and money for them. Having more flexibility in how you can make a counter-chain strategy can really help. And if you're playing the story mode in one of the Untold games, there's also going to be another boss after you finish each area, so maybe save some resources for that one too. But with those things out of the way, get your hands on these games and start playing. If you want to learn more about these games, be sure to subscribe. It really helps me out. And if you're feeling particularly generous, I also have channel memberships available. See you guys next time.